All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second session of the Spring's Education Policy Colloquium series, sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance. My name is Jim Pizer, and I'm an academic visitor here at Kennedy School, and it's a pleasure to be hosting these sessions along with the PEPG leadership of Paul Peterson and Marty West. We meet here most Thursdays, or at least we meet here semi-regularly on Thursdays at noon in Taubman. And our next session is coming up on March 26th. It will feature Shavar Jeffries, who's the CEO of the KIPP Foundation. We'll be talking about KIPP's 30-plus-year history, its evolution, and its opportunities and challenges today. So I hope that you can all join us for that session too. And that's in 2 weeks from now. Today, we don't just have one speaker, we have two. So we've got a twofer here with Vlad Kogan and Scott Levy on the subject of local school boards and their unique and sometimes fraught politics. As you all probably know, even though federal and state education policy gets a lot of media attention, the real action in public education governance is at the local level. And that's where decisions are made about school spending, curriculum, graduation standards, discipline policies, hiring and firing of superintendents, and of course teacher contracts, not to mention school building projects and in some cases tax levies. So there's a lot of action going on there, but it's also the place where the public comes face to face with policymakers. I had the privilege of serving as an appointed member to the Massachusetts State Board of Education for about 18 years. And even though I served on and off for that long period of time, I would say there probably aren't 10 people in the state who would have recognized me on the street. But when you're a local elected school board member, people not only know who you are, but they know where you live, which means that these people are on the front lines of democracy. And that's not an easy job these days, as you can all appreciate. But it does beg the question, is all this democracy working for kids? And so that's hopefully what we'll have a chance to talk about today. And we'll start off with a presentation from Vlad entitled The Gerrymandering of K-12 Education, followed by Scott, who will provide a response based on his own personal experiences as an elected school board member, as well as the author of a recently published book called Why School Boards Matter. By way of introduction, Dr. Vladimir Kogan is a professor of political science at The Ohio State University. Did I get that right? Excellent. And is director of undergraduate studies. He earned his PhD at the University of California at San Diego, and his most recent book is No Adult Left Behind: How Politics Hijacks Education Policy and Hurts Kids. As I mentioned, Scott Levy is an elected school board member from the Byron Hill School District in Westchester County, which is my ancestral home, and is past president of the Westchester Putnam School Board Association. He spent much of his career as an investment banker and has recently become an adjunct lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. After comments from Vlad and Scott, we'll have ample time for questions and answers and discussion, and we'll give priority to folks who are in the room, but hopefully we've got some folks who are zooming in online as well, and so we'll try to put them into the conversation. So if you are watching via Zoom, make sure to put your questions or thoughts into the comments, and we'll try to work them into the discussion here. This session is being recorded. The recording will be put up on the website. And will be posted for all to see over time, so we are on the record. And with that, it's my privilege to turn it over to Vlad.
Thanks, Jim, for inviting me. Thank you to Antonio for help with all logistics. And special thanks to Scott. He was actually in New York this morning and drove all the way here just to be here for this event. So yeah, I'm really grateful. His book, Why School Boards Matter, Reclaiming the Heart of American Education Democracy, is really great. I had a chance to read it. And actually, our two books were reviewed by Spin. They came out about 2 weeks apart. And it was a great review that I think raised some interesting questions. And Scott and I had a chance to actually Zoom shortly thereafter and really have a great discussion. So his book's outstanding. I'm not saying that only because he cites a lot of my research in this book. That's a plastic problem. One last thanks is actually to Marty. So Marty was very kind to give a blurb for my book. And Cambridge liked it so much that now if you actually go to Amazon, there's a giant image just with Marty's quote, because I guess they thought it would be good for sale. So thank you. So again, I'm really excited to be here. I have to apologize. I do worry that maybe the title might have tricked you to be here, because this is not necessarily about the kind of gerrymandering that you may be thinking of. And actually, I gave a version of this presentation about a month ago at the University of Southern California, and it was the day after the Supreme Court ruled on the California congressional gerrymandering case. And so I think you will see why I chose this title and kind of the provocative nature of my argument. And so Jim asked me to discuss the book that came out last August. And so most of the presentation is going to be giving you a big picture overview. And then I have some really new data at the very end that I got about 2 weeks ago that is related. And it's with the joint work with Michael Hartney, who may be on Zoom right now watching as well. And so this book is about governance. It's based on about a decade worth of research. So I'm an empirical scholar. Usually, when I give these kinds of presentations, there's a lot of difference models and event study plots. I'm not going to have any of that in the presentation today, because what I want to do for the purpose of the presentation, there's a lot of that in the book. But what I want to do in the presentation is really give you or make the case about the big idea behind the book that's informed by some of these analyses, and see what you think, see what Scott thinks. And so, this will give you kind of a preview of my argument. And I will say, it's going to be provocative. Some of the examples I'll use will be, I think, controversial, and I think some of you, will find them especially controversial. I'm not using them just to be controversial. I'm using them, I think, because they help us really confront difficult trade-offs in education governance that we too often kind of sweep aside. And so by picking these examples in particular, I'm hopeful that it will get us to wrestle with, I think, really difficult questions that we usually try not to wrestle with. So there are several audience participation portions. So I'll let you know when it's an opportunity to do that. So I'm going to start with kind of the big picture framing. And this is, again, to be provocative. Really a central idea in my book is that Earl Warren, who's Chief Justice in the 1950s, 1960s, was wrong. And it was wrong in a way I think that's really consequential for how we think about education governance. And so what do I mean by that? Well, so after he retired, he was on the court for, again, almost 2 decades. And there was many famous decisions that were issued during the Warren era. So he would always get asked by journalists about, Chief Justice Warren, there's so many important cases that were decided. What is your favorite case? What do you think is the most important case of your tenure on the court? And so any guesses about what he said? So this is the first audience participation opportunity. What do you think he thought was the most important?
It's got to be a trick with Brown v. Board.
Yeah, so everybody thought he would say Brown versus Board of Education, which was the opinion that ended state-sanctioned discrimination and segregation in schools. And so everybody expected him to say that, and it is a trick actually because that's not what he said. And everybody was always shocked. He said that accolade should go to the case Baker v. Carr, which was the progenitor of the one-man, one-vote rule. And so Baker v. Carr and the companion case, Reynolds v. Sins, really established the idea that when you draw districts, they have to have equal population. So before Baker v. Carr, we had malapportionment. So we had congressional districts that had very large numbers of people. And this was particularly important in the South because malapportionment was used strategically to dilute the power of Black voters who lived mostly in urban areas. And so Chief Justice Warren said, this is actually at the core of educational equity. And he went on to say, if we had already had universal voting, then we wouldn't have had many of the problems that Brown versus Board of Education attempted to correct. Many of our problems would have been solved a long time ago if everyone had the right to vote, and his vote counted as everyone else's. And so, I think the point is, we wouldn't have needed Brown, as important as Brown was, if we had actually fixed the governance that led to some of the inequities that Brown tried to address. And so my contention to you is actually that this is wrong, right? That this is actually not correct. This wasn't correct at the time. In fact, Chief Justice Earl Warren should have known that this was not correct. And I think, as you'll see, it remains incorrect for the same reasons. So, the reason why this is an important case is if you look in the political science literature, many trace the origins of modern-day gerrymandering to Baker v. Carr. Because now that we have to redistrict every 10 years when we have new census data, it's very predictable. So it's clear when your party has to be in control of state government. And so, scholars like Gary Cox and Jonathan Katz have argued that this is really the origins of the modern day congressional gerrymandering. So you can see kind of the connection to the title. So, but why is this kind of related to my argument? Well, I think the premise behind this intuition that Chief Justice Warren had was that if we provided voting rights for adults, that would bring about high quality schools for kids. And I think this was kind of the theory that was articulated in these two books. And my argument is that this is just fundamentally incorrect. That providing political power, political influence for adults does not necessarily, sometimes it does, but does not necessarily translate into good education for kids. And I think, most controversially, I think sometimes is actually the main barrier to providing a high quality education to kids. Because the interests of adults, voting adults, may actually be not at all aligned with the needs of students that schools are serving. And my contention is that this is not just true today. This was actually true at the time that Brown was being decided. And again, that Chief Justice Warren should have known all this. And let me give you two reasons, historical reasons, just very quickly, why I think you should have known this. And I should mention, this at the beginning, I do like questions throughout, so please don't wait. If you want to interrupt, please do so. So I want to take you, so Brown supports education is decided in the early 1950s. I want to take you about half a century earlier to Indiana. And there was an interesting kind of event in Indiana that I think helps preview some of the dynamics I'm going to talk about. So Indiana in the 1890s was one of the only northern states that allowed segregation in education. Didn't require it, it allowed it. And Indianapolis actually had segregated schools. And so in 1897, there was a gentleman named Gabriel Jones who was elected to the Indiana state legislature. And he was the only African-American member of the state legislature at the time. And he's got kind of very interesting, colorful personality. He was born in Tennessee. He moved to Indiana, had like a long series of jobs. He was a police officer. He was a federal tax collector. He was a deputy county recorder. Eventually, he became a teacher in Indianapolis and a principal. And education became his passion. So in 1897, he's elected to the state legislature. And he knows he's only going to be there for 1 year. So he has one shot to do something important for his constituents. And he said, I know I'm going to introduce a bill to desegregate the schools in Indiana, because this is how I can have the biggest impact on my constituents. So he introduces a bill to ban school segregation. It's going through committees, and there's no opposition at all. It's very popular. In fact, the white legislators are not only supportive of this bill, but they actually strengthen the enforcement. And they add criminal penalties for not allowing kids to go to the school nearest their house. So it seems like it's going to be passed again. There's literally no opposition. So one day, Gabriel Jones arrives at his office, and there are two petitions from constituents on different sides of this issue. And the nature of the petitions is somewhat interesting. So one of the petitions is opposing the legislation. And it's actually coming from the current African-American educators in Indianapolis. Because they're concerned if school segregation is outlawed, they would lose their jobs in the all-black schools, because that's where the black educators are working. So petition one says, if such a bill becomes a law, we believe it will be detrimental to the colored people of the state, that it will deprive not only ourselves, but many colored men and women of their livelihood, that it will remove the opportunity that colored men and women now have to strive after and obtain honorable employment in the public school. So there's a counter petition. So a lot of the prominent African-American civic leaders in Indianapolis write in saying, no, you got to integrate the schools. They say Indiana is alone of all the northern states to keep up this discrimination against colored children. We ask no special or class legislation, but simply that class legislation on our books be removed. And so now, what seemed like an obvious issue is not so obvious. And the white legislators don't really know what to do. And they really want to make the right decision. But they want to do what is reflective of the interests of the African American community, but they don't know which of these groups is speaking for the African American community. So they reach out to a gentleman named George Knox, who is the publisher of the Indianapolis Freeman, which is at the time the largest African American newspaper in the country. So they schedule a meeting with him, and they say, Mr. Knox, we have these two petitions. Please, you probably have a better pulse on the sense of the African American community. Tell us what you think is the right policy decision here. And according to a book about this time period, it said, quote, he spoke against the adoption of the law because of its enforcement, but put so many African American educators out of work. And so, taking that advice, the legislature votes down the bill. And Indianapolis schools remain segregated for the next 40 years. And I think previewing, I think, some of the dynamics that, again, Chief Justice Earl Warren should have been thinking about and should have been recognizing. So I want to talk about the Brown case itself, because not only was this, this happened 50 years earlier in Indianapolis, maybe he didn't know about it, but there's actually facts in the Brown case itself that I think preview that some of these same tensions. And so I'm going to just very quickly draw on just a couple of data points for you. So first, some of you may know Brown versus Board of Education came actually several decades after the Supreme Court first got involved in integration efforts. It started at the higher education level because there was in the South segregated universities, and certain programs were so specialized that it was just not possible to have programs at both universities, and that was the original basis for litigation, that it definitely was not equal if you couldn't get a law degree if the Black university didn't have a law school. So the Supreme Court first started ordering higher education integration starting late 1930s. And it was clear immediately that this had some unintended consequences for faculty at historically Black schools, because when universities were integrated, many of those universities ended up downsizing and laying off their faculty. And so in the lead up to the Brown decision, so the year before the case is argued, there's an article in Nation magazine, which at the time was kind of one of the most widely read liberal publications, by Oliver Cox, who was a sociologist at a historically Black university, who was saying, hey, this is what happened when our university was integrated, and we should be concerned because we're going to make teachers martyrs. And so here's what he says in this article. While some selfless champions of our democracy may think that their employment and that of others are nothing compared to the achievement of integration, this position seems to be, in general, unsound. Freedom to work is at least as sacred as the right to non-discrimination in education. Indeed, education itself will have decreasing value if the occasion to employ it is increasingly limited. And so why is he concerned? Well, if you look in the North, which again, by 1950 doesn't have at least segregated schools by law, almost all the educators in the North are white. So less than 2% of teachers are African American. If you look in the South during a period of school segregation, about 1 in 3 teachers are African American, and they work in the segregated schools. And so the employment considerations are really important here. And in fact, if you go to the 1950 census and you download the census microdata, which is I think a 5% sample, and then you subset just to the South, and you subset just to African Americans that have college degrees, and then you look at the occupations. The number one occupation is teacher, public school teacher. It accounts for 60% of all the employment for African Americans with college degrees, and that's more than like the next 10 occupations combined. So the employment considerations are really important. And by the way, we know that this concern was valid. We know after schools are integrated in the South, based on work of economist Owen Thompson, that about 40% of African American educators end up losing their jobs. So there was legitimate concern to be worried. So this is clearly, again, in people's minds in the lead up to the Brown case. And it's actually kind of part of the story of the Brown case itself. And I just want to briefly mention there's a fantastic history of Brown versus Board of Education by journalist Richard Kluger, who's still alive. He's in his 90s. It's about 1,000 pages. It is just really incredible read because he talks to everybody. He talked to many of the litigants. He talked to all the attorneys. He talked to Thurgood Marshall. He talked to many of the justices and their clerks. And so this is the kind of the definitive oral history of the Brown case. And there's an interesting puzzle in the Brown case because, Brown versus Board of Education is how we think about this case, but that wasn't actually the full title. Does anybody know the full name of this case? And it's actually really important for the story.
Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas.
Topeka, yes. Yeah, it's the Board of Topeka. And of course, the puzzle is, well, why Topeka? Because Topeka is not the largest city in Kansas in 1953. In fact, Wichita is the largest city. It's the state capital. So you would think if you were trying to bring a huge case, right, to tax segregation, you would actually go into like the largest school district. And that was originally the plan. That was actually originally the plan. And so a lot of the efforts in Kansas originally really evolved out of activism by a white Jewish woman named Esther Brown. And Esther Brown, it has a domestic worker who's African American, and she drives her home every day. And one day they're passing the school that her maid's kids go to, and Esther Brown says, "This is outrageous. This is a substandard school." And they live in a small community called South Park. So Esther Brown leads this effort to get the community mobilized to desegregate the South Park schools. They're successful, and then she says, all right, we've done South Park, let's go to Wichita because it's the state capital, it's the largest school district. She gets there, and it turns out no one's interested in integrating schools. So here's from Kluger's book. Flushed with the victory in the South Park case, Esther Brown pushed the NAACP in Wichita, the biggest city in Kansas, to launch a suit against segregation. But she was beaten by the teachers who feared for their jobs. And the teachers were very active in the NAACP, and they said, no way can we bring this case because we lose our jobs. So she said, all right, well, I guess we're not going to do Wichita. She looks around and says, well, what about Topeka? Now, it turns out in Topeka, the teachers are also not very excited about this. So again, from Kluger's book, that little leadership came from the blacks less trained to supply it, was particularly apparent amongst the 36 or so colored public school teachers of Topeka, who wanted no part in any drive to desegregate the grade schools. Now, the high schools were actually not segregated in Topeka, just the grade schools. But unlike Wichita, in Topeka, the teachers were not part of the NAACP. They were not members. And so she was able to convince the NAACP to bring the case. And in fact, they were not members precisely because they were worried that the NAACP would try to desegregate the school. So again, one last quote for you. It was hardly surprising then that as the NAACP reorganized itself in Topeka after the war, no black teachers joined it. It was a threat to them in more ways than one. Most obvious was its growing interest in ending segregated schools. So again, this is the backdrop for the Brown case, which I think raises some questions about our theory that, again, if we provide voting rights to adults, they will always act in the way that's good for kids. Again, it wasn't, I think, obvious that that would be the case on school segregation and integration. And so I want to bring you to the present. The reason why I start with the Brown case is actually, it's not just to kind of set up the conversation, because on the day that Brown is decided, there's actually several other cases decided the same day. So it's actually a group of cases brought at the same time. One of those cases is different than the others, and it's the case Bowling v. Sharp, because it involves Washington, D.C., and the rest involve local school districts. And the reason why this case is unusual is the legal theory of Brown is the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, but that applies only to the states. And so it does not apply to the federal government, and so it does not apply to Washington, D.C. So if you want to strike down school desegregation in D.C., you need a different legal theory. And so in Bowling v. Sharp on the same day, Bowling v. Sharp has a different opinion because they kind of put together a different theory based on the 15th Amendment. And the D.C. case is really interesting for the reasons that you'll see in a second. So it involves a school on the southeastern side called John Philip Sousa Middle School, which is named after a famous American composer. And it's an all-white school in southeastern D.C. Brand new school built in 1950, and it's massively under-enrolled. And right next door is an all-black school that's massively over-enrolled. So there is a group of about a dozen black parents who take their kids to Philip Sousa and say, we want to enroll our kids in this school. They said, we can't. It's an all-white school, and they sue. They're the plaintiffs in the Bowling v. Sharp case. And so in the same day that Brown is issued, Bowling v. Sharp is issued, striking down school segregation in D.C. And so John Philip Sousa becomes an integrated middle school. Okay, so so I'm going to bring it up to the present, and I think D.C. is a really interesting example to think about, because if Chief Justice Warren is right, if providing voting power for African Americans brings about good education for African American kids, it should happen in Washington, D.C. Because Washington, D.C., very famously, is the first city that has a majority black electorate. And so the nickname that D.C. has, Chocolate City, is actually kind of reflective, supposed to reflect that fact. And in fact, in the 1970s, there is a new mayor elected who is a former school board president, Marion Barry, and a former civil rights leader. So again, you would think, this is a perfect opportunity to provide good schools for kids. And so Marion Barry is, again, and some of you may know, gets what's controversial later, but is very interested in the schools, very active in the school system, but not necessarily in ways that is related to kids and learning. So just like many other African-American mayors during this time, part of his platform is requiring minority contract set-asides in local government. And so, again, there's many African-American mayors elected during this period on that platform. So Marion Barry initially says, 25% of all DC contracts have to go to minorities, and then eventually that's increased to 35%. And so this creates a kind of a budget challenge because it turns out those contracts cost more and the budget constraint is the same. So there is a conversation between Marion Barry and the superintendent of schools, an African-American gentleman named Vince Reed, as retold by Vince Reed. So again, take it with a grain of salt. This is his account of how the conversation goes. But here's how Vince Reed remembers it. He says, he goes to the mayor, says, Mr. Mayor, I understand that you want to give contracts to black companies. But when you tell me to take food out of a black kid's stomach so some black dude could get rich, I have to ask, what is your rationale? And according to Vince Reed, Mayor Barry responds, black entrepreneurs are at the top of my agenda. We have to do it this way. It's the only way to get them into the mainstream. So by the 1990s, DC is facing a financial crisis. They have ongoing budget deficits. Congress creates a financial responsibility and management assistant authority to take over and balance the books. And in 1996, this authority puts out a damning report on the state of DC schools titled Children in Crisis. And the report says that DC schools, it's the deplorable record of the district's public schools by every important educational and management measure has left one of the city's most important public responsibilities in a state of crisis, creating an emergency which can no longer be ignored or excused. The District of Columbia Public School is failing its mission to educate the children of the District of Columbia. So the following year, 1997, there's a front page expose in Washington Post titled A Well-Financed Failure. System protects jobs while shortchanging classrooms, and it begins with kind of striking fact that DC is one of the highest spending school districts in the country. So clearly, this is not a story about lack of resources. And yet, not only is it dysfunctional, but according to the opening sentence, quote, schools still wind up short of books, crayons, toilet paper, and in some schools, even teachers. So again, pretty dire status. So in 2003, the Council of Great City Schools, which is a membership organization for large urban school districts, issued their own report on the basis of recently released NAEP data, where they compare DC public schools to other urban districts, and they say DC is one of the lowest performing big city school districts in the nation. And in 2006, there was a mayoral election in DC, and a young council member named Adrian Fenty is elected mayor, in part on a platform of fixing the school system in DC. One of the first things he does once he's elected is he convinces city council to essentially eliminate the school board, to eliminate the superintendent, to vest all power in the mayor, and creates a new position of school chancellor to oversee the school system. And so this becomes very controversial because of the person he picks to be the school chancellor. Again, somebody may know, somebody that's here, I think, frequently for these talks. It's Michelle Rhee, who is controversial for many reasons. First of all, she's not African-American, overseeing a majority black school system. She's not a DC native. She's actually from Toledo, Ohio. And she's actually not an educator. She had spent a few years in the classroom in Teach for America, but has really not been an educator since then. And so this is the cover, I think, in 2009 of Time magazine with her with a broom that becomes very controversial. There is a really fantastic book. So you should read my book. You should read Scott's book. You should read Richard Kluger's book. And you should definitely read Richard Whitmire's book, The Bee Eater, which is a kind of a biography of Michelle Rhee. And he's actually following Michelle Rhee around during this time period. And I'm going to draw just a few examples from this book as well, because I think it's really important context. And so I will talk about what happens, but before I do, I want to just mention, so in 2021, Mathematica completes a study of DC public schools, really to see what happens during the Michelle Rhee era and subsequently. Now, again, it's paid for by Arnold Ventures. So again, I'll mention that as well. But it shows that on the yes.
Why did he choose her? I missed that. It sounds like she was very unqualified, but I must be missing
She was
something.
a reformer, so she was leading kind of a reform group to bring in high quality teachers, sort of adjacent to Teach for America. So she was still active in education, and kind of a member of the education reform community. And this was a period, kind of a high point of bipartisan education reform. And so she was recommended. To him by somebody who said, "Hey, if you want somebody that will really take on vested interests and fight for kids, this is your person." Yes.
And then you can remind me if this is correct or not, but she was in charge of implementing Impact, which is a teacher evaluation system.
Yes. Exactly.
And is that where the witch's broom is stemming from?
Well, yes.
I feel like I remember a video leaking of her like screaming in people's faces.
Yes.
But that's the only
she's
context I
controversial.
have.
She's controversial for a couple of years. You know, she claims the broom was unintentional. They just asked her to stand with the broom. But the implication is, yes, that she's going to sweep away the bad teachers. This is related to her teacher reform efforts. She's really also famously, and I'll show you a clip of this, in 2013, there's a frontline documentary called The Education of Michelle Reed, and she decides it's a good idea to fire a principal on camera, which becomes kind of a point of controversy. But anyway, the thing I want to mention is, you know, the Mathematica study shows pretty massive improvements in DC schools during this period. And so this is important context for some of the conversations that I want to have. Okay. So the reason why this is so interesting is Sousa Middle School, which was the school, the all-white school that was the basis for the original desegregation case, is now also central to Michelle Reed's reform efforts. And so this is an article in 2010 on the new principal that Michelle Reed has brought to DC, to Phillips Sousa Middle School. And I wanted to point your attention to the caption. Sousa, one of the few middle schools in Washington to substantially improve students' test scores, used to have some of the lowest results in the city. Now it's a model for others. And I want to just read you a couple of quotes from this 2010 profile of the school from the Washington Post. And the first is kind of before Reed, and the second is after Reed, to give you some context. So this is before Reed. Okay? Privately, one faculty member at another school called it, quote, a dumping ground for burned out teachers, a place toxic with low expectations, where students roamed the halls and fought. 80% of the Southeast school students are from low-income families. 99% are African American, and most come from neighborhoods where violence, drugs, and other uncertainties invade childhoods. When DC Public School Chancellor Michelle Reed appointed Principal DeJuan Jordan to take over the freshly renovated school 2 years ago, only 23% of the students were proficient in reading, 17% proficient in math. So here's after. Described by one former colleague as a very, 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 I can't say enough, very competitive, Principal Jordan fired most of the staff and pushed through other changes his first year. The teachers union fought him. Some parents asked for his dismissal. Then the test results came in. Reading proficiency rose to 39%, math to 42%. Although those lagged behind some DC public charter schools, Sousa's gains were the biggest of any public middle school in the city last year, and they have drawn attention. So Sousa, again, is kind of back in the news. Now, so he fires most of the teachers. Around the same time period, DC is having a kind of a mini budget crisis. And Michelle Reed announces that there's 240 teachers who are going to be fired on the basis not of seniority, but of performance. This is very controversial. And in fact, this comes up in that 2013 Frontline documentary, and they ask her about some of the backlash. And I just want to play you a clip because I think it's going to be really important for the rest of the talk. So here's just a short clip from this documentary.
We're not running this school district through the democratic process.
It's not a democracy.
No, it's not a democracy.
And so, of course, ironically enough, the reason why this quote is so powerful is it is a democracy. And in fact, her boss, Adrian Fenty, is up for re-election that year. And actually, I learned when she was here last year, talking to a group of students, she actually, Michael Hardy was here, mentioned she actually offered to Mayor Fenty, say, hey, why don't we wait a year to announce the firings until after the election so that it's not going to be an issue. And apparently, again, according to her, she said, Adrian Fenty said, no way, because that will mean another year of bad teachers for these kids. Do it now, even if it's controversial. So it does become controversial. So in 2010, Fenty is running for re-election. It's clear that it's a referendum on education. It's clear it's a referendum on the reforms happening in DC public schools. And so I'm going to play you a clip. I edited this down. This is from CNN on some public opinion data on the eve of the election. And I want to just highlight two things for you. One is going to be a question about how are things going? Are things doing better or not? And specifically on education. And then some of the geographic differences. And then you'll see another conversation with Michelle Reed on this.
One of the big primary contests this night is right here in the District of Columbia. This is the incumbent mayor, Democrat Adrian Fenty. This is his prime challenger. There are several challenges, but the City Council Chairman Vince Gray is the prime challenger right now. And we want to show you something interesting about this mayor, because if you ask people in the District of Columbia, how are things going, look at this. 64% of residents of the District of Columbia say that positive things have happened under Mayor Fenty. So you would think this guy would be in good shape for a big defining issue from is education reform. The teachers union is spending a lot of money because Michelle Rhee is Mayor Fenty's handpicked school chancellor. A few months back, she fired more than 200 teachers. She says if test scores don't improve, she will hold the teachers accountable and fire them. She was on this program a short time ago. She says she knows she's controversial, and she doesn't really care.
No, I'm not here to be well liked. I don't care about being popular. Mayor Fenty brought me here to fix the school system. And in order to do that, you've got to make some incredibly hard decisions that sometimes rankle, people. And for me, that's okay as long as I feel like I'm serving the children well.
Okay, so this election, and again, many of you know, Adrian Fenty loses. He's not reelected. Vince Gray is reelected, and again, this gets national attention. This is seen as a referendum on Fenty's reforms. So again, the campaign centered on his efforts for education reform. Here's what's really interesting: Phillips Sousa Middle School is actually polling location for this election. And Richard Whitmire, who's doing his biography by Michelle Rhee, goes to Sousa to interview voters as they're leaving, and he cannot find a single person that voted for Adrian Fenty. And he's so shocked by this that, this is crazy. This is the fastest improving school. How can there be not a single vote? He actually does something that journalists usually never do. He commissions a professional poll of just this precinct in Southeast DC to measure public opinion. Like, what's going on? Are these anecdotal things he's seeing in the interviews, are they consistent? So 2 weeks after the election, this professional firm does a study. It's in Ward 7, which is the location of Phillips Sousa Middle School. And so these are slides from the slide deck that they give to Whitmire. And I'm just going to walk you through the results. I'm almost done, I promise. Okay. So the first question is, thinking about public schools here in Ward 7, do you think elementary and secondary schools in this area have improved or gotten worse since Michelle Rhee became education chancellor? And so this is all respondents, and you can see more say improved than gotten worse. And then there's different breakdowns. This column over here is just parents of DC public school kids. And the last column is just parents of Sousa Middle School kids. So they have a large enough sample that they can measure public opinion just for the parents. And you can see 2-to-1 see that the school has gotten better. So this is not a story about like they're not registering the improvements. So then they say, do you agree, disagree? Public schools in DC are moving in the right direction. And again, you can see, amongst all respondents, 2-to-1 saying right, yes. Amongst Sousa parents, 3-to-1 saying yes. So they agree that the schools are getting better. So then they say, agree, disagree. I support Mayor Fenty's school reforms, but oppose the methods he used to get them done. And now, again, it flips. Now, 47% are agreeing with, I like the idea, I don't like the methods. And amongst Sousa parents, also, 47% agreeing with the statement, 34% disagree. So you might say, well, what is it about the method? So they ask, agree, disagree. The firing and replacement of teachers at Sousa Middle School was needed to make the school better. Amongst all respondents, again, 2-to-1 now disagreeing. Even amongst Sousa parents who have seen the school before and after, more disagree than agree. So this really catches Whitmire's eye. And, he says, only 22% think you needed to fire the teachers. So he goes back, he does more interviews. Says, is this realistic? Could we have turned around the school with the staff that it had? So he goes to the school, he talks to the teachers who were there already, he talks to the counselors. And so here's what he says from his book. Only 22%, again, this is referring to the poll, thought it was necessary to fire and replace Sousa teachers. Yet when I toured Sousa and talked to the principal, Jordan, teachers and curriculum coaches, it seemed clear that keeping the old staff wasn't an option. That observation became even clearer when I visited schools nearby where principals haven't changed staffs that for years consisted of the teachers no other schools would touch. In those places, proficiency rates in math and reading still linger below 20%. You'd think that level of achievement would unleash a political backlash. But that's not what got voters in the Sousa precinct angry. Reform did. At least reform that involved firing teachers. Mayors, beware. So pretty interesting. And so last question. who did you vote for in the election? And you can see among Sousa parents, 16% voted for the incumbent Adrian Fenty, 69% voted for Vincent Gray, even though they saw the improvements in the schools. And so I think my question to you is this. If turning one of the worst performing schools in one of the lowest performing school districts into one of the fastest improving costs an incumbent his job, where else could you ever get reelected actually serving interests, especially, and again, I think the especially is important, when that requires doing things that are unpopular with adults. When it's not unpopular with adults, I think that's an easy call. Unfortunately, I think many of the education questions we deal with involve that trade-off. Yes.
I don't know if you know what the N is, but I did not see an N for that study. Do you know what the N was for the people in that district? The Sousa school?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I gotta go back. So the entire N for the ward was, I think around 500, maybe 1,000. Again, what subset were parents? So you're right. Yeah, it's a noisy measure. But again, we know the vote result of the precinct that day, and Gray carried overwhelmingly.
Well, I was just curious because to me it's completely illogical what you're showing, right? And I think that's why you're showing it. But is it possible that the people that they were related to are very close to those teachers? Because it doesn't.
Family members? Yeah. Okay.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Good question. So. Well, I think it could make sense. So one possibility, are these family members of teachers? So we actually, I'll be here back in May for Paula Peterson's conference. We have a nice paper. We have administrative data from Ohio, and we link all the teachers in Ohio to the voter file, and then we identify all their household members based on shared addresses, and very few voters are teachers, even in really low turnout elections. And very few of the voters are relatives. So I don't think this is a story about relatives.
Okay.
Now, again, I think, if you look at, again, and there's people in the room that know this case even better than I do, but there was definitely a lot of narrative. There's millions of dollars in advertising. And the message was, you didn't need to fire the teachers, right? You could have had the same improvements and kept the jobs. And I think many people just genuinely believed that story, that they just rejected the idea that there was a trade-off. And I think that narrative is often made, do we need to close schools so we can redeploy the resources? No, you can have under-enrolled schools and still not undermine quality. So I think, and I think you can make that case and people believe it. Yes.
Yeah, I just think to that point, something that I noticed was that about a third of the respondents didn't have an answer to the question. They were not sure. Yeah. And so I wonder if they weren't sure in the case of responding to this one isolated question, but then when it came to voting at the booth, the public narrative was so strong that the whole approach had seemed too heavy-handed, and they wanted to vote against the reform.
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. Antonio, you're comfortable. Yeah.
A couple of years ago,
after this, if we could sort of wrap up, and then we can open up for questions.
Yeah.
There was a narrative here a couple of years ago on expanding charter schools.
Yeah.
And the statement that one is that charter schools take away money from public schools.
Yes. Yeah. So absolutely. So and so I think that's my big idea, right? That that many educational policies involve trading off interests of adults and students. And when these trade-offs are required, we have a system that's gerrymandered. It's not gerrymandered for one party or the other, but it's gerrymandered to really put more weight on the interests of adults, even if that means coming at the expense of students. And so I think this is the fundamental kind of disagreement with Earl Warren, who just assumed that the interests of adults and kids would always be aligned with the adult voters. And I think it's clear that's not the case. So in this case, again, the trade-off is between employment and student outcomes. And again, in the book, I go through, I think, many other examples of other kinds of trade-offs. So again, culture war type issues and how that impacts school administration, partisanship and kind of where voters get attitudes about education issues and to what extent that reflects kind of considerations of students. Some real estate stuff and how homeowners, in an effort to protect their values, may make decisions that are suboptimal, and a few things like that. And really the core thing that I hope you take away is, I think one of the challenges, not the only challenge, but one of the challenges is that democracy is about adults. Most of those adults don't have school-age children. So we should not necessarily expect them to make these trade-offs in a way that's optimal. Again, now being a parent is not sufficient because, again, in that survey, you had parents who are still making trade-offs in a way that's probably not optimal. But I think this really further exacerbates some of the challenges. So before I turn it over to Scott, I have two more slides for you, and this is the new data. And to give you a sense of why I think actually this is somewhat unique in education and how we approach education, how we think about trade-offs, people just, their minds just don't work the same way as they do in other areas. So in November, we had a survey on the cooperative election study. It's a national sample. And so we had people read the statement. We said, for many years, a local public school has performed poorly. Even though the school is well-funded, student academic outcomes remain well below the average of other public schools in the state. Many student advocates argue that the school should be closed because it prevents students from going to better schools. But many residents oppose closure. They say the school is a community institution and a major local employer. They argue that student outcomes should not drive the decision and that other considerations, including school staff jobs, should matter more. And then we say, would you support closing this poorly performed public school? So half of the people got this question. The other half got the same question. We just did Control F. We replaced the word school with hospital. We replaced student outcomes with patient outcomes. And then we said, same exact setup. Would you support closing this poorly performing hospital so that patients could get better healthcare elsewhere? And here's what we found. And again, we had no idea what we would find. Amongst Republicans, didn't matter what you asked. They wanted to close both the school and hospital. Yeah, again, poorly performing, that's an important part of the story. Amongst Democrats, you saw a big divide. So when you ask them about the hospital, the majority of Democrats, just like the Republicans, they say, if the hospital is failing patients, who cares if it's an employer? Who cares if there's jobs at risk? We got to do what's best for patients. When you talked about school, only a third agreed about closing the school, and suddenly the concerns about adult employment at community institutions were much more salient. I think this illustrates some of the interesting dynamics that I think stand in the way of education reform, particularly I think in blue areas like DC, where maybe the trade-offs are particularly salient and involve some of these partisan considerations. So thank you. With that, I'll turn it over to Scott, and thank you all for coming.
So appreciate the presentation and all of your work, because I've benefited greatly from your research, your work, data that you've collected, the analysis that you've done, and I've shared that with my students. And as you said, in my book, because I think it certainly informed my thinking, and we do have a lot of places where I think we would generally agree, one of which is that there needs to be, maniacal focus on student outcomes and doing the right things by students. We need to think about the fact that voter turnout is very low in school board elections, dangerously low in some places, and that it's not always the composition of voting that you would think, given the constituents that are attending the school, fair enough. And there are certainly lots of flaws when you look across, America at, school boards. No institution's perfect. School boards aren't perfect. I think at the same time, I take a different approach in terms of thinking through the role of school boards, not only in education, but also more broadly in our democracy. And I think about some of the reforms that you suggest, which I think you share in your book, which I think are interesting and worthy of consideration, but I also have some trepidation about some of them. And so I kind of want to explain, and then we'll open it up, and I'll try to be quick. Four main points that I would talk about. The first is that one of the interesting concepts that you talk about is putting a letter grade or some kind of a metric on ballots, so that when a voter goes to the voting booth, they have a sense of how the school performs. And that can inform their voting potentially, just getting better information. I align with you on the fact that we have to have a better way of getting information out to voters. I think that's super important. And oftentimes people will go to the ballot box if they go and not be fully informed. So anything we could do on that front is good. I hesitate on any one metric. That's my issue. And it comes down to two, and there's another reason too, which is that when you think about a school board is made up of 5, 7, 9 individuals. And it's very plausible that you could have a low-performing school. You could have a school board member that's running for re-election. They may be the voice at the table against the status quo, trying to change things. And so that letter may not reflect their position statements. And they could be running against someone that's supporting the status quo. So just because you're an incumbent in a bad school, or for that matter, you're an incumbent in a good district where you may be trying to steer the ship in a bad direction, I think that you always have to think about the board as a whole versus the individual board member. And oftentimes the individual board member, doesn't have, they only have 1 out of 5 or 7 or 9 votes. The second piece is about that metric. So I think we saw this in New York State when there was a push around Race to the Top to link test score changes, the growth score to teacher evaluations. And overnight, that really changed the dynamics in New York State around the way schools were run. And I don't mean that as an overstatement. This is around 2013. And there was a dramatic shift that was sensed not only in schools that were underperforming, but schools that were well-resourced and performing at the 99th percentile. There was universal concern among not only teachers, but parents that things were changing in the schools. Students weren't reading as many novels anymore because that wasn't really, part of what was being tested. There was a reduction in the amount of social studies and foreign language and art and music because that wasn't being tested. And so it got people very exercised. So then the question is, this was one time when the parent community really was exercised. They were informed, they knew what was going on. So how do we affect change? Well, this was a state policy, not a local school board policy. As a school board member for 10 years, I can assure you that though maybe people don't always vote, if they are upset, they will know where to find you. Nobody knew what to do. And so there was a coalition built on a grassroots basis of parents. And first there was, yelling and screaming and a lot of writing letters and talking to legislators, and nothing was happening. And 2 years went by, and the only reason that the state policy ended up changing was because of this opt-out movement, which was really civil disobedience, saying we're not going to have our kids sit for the tests. And in aggregate, 20% of New York State parents, which outside of New York City, where this really wasn't happening as much, the number was more like 30%, decided not to sit for the exams. That clearly got the state attention because now they were in violation of all federal rules around testing. And so there was a sea change in policy at that point, but it took 2 years and literally 20% opt-outs, which I like to say was a larger percentage of people than that voted for Cuomo, who was the governor at the time, given the overall eligible voter population compared to who voted yes for Cuomo. So it was very, very significant in terms of that pushback. So if you really want a system that is closest to parents and theoretically, their students' interests, then hopefully the school board system gives you that ability. The other point that I think is interesting, because I've talked about this a lot lately and I think about it a lot, is that the culture wars. Is it a bad thing? Is it taking our eye off of education outcomes? And I've really come to terms with this in a different way than maybe originally, because I think originally I was more arguing what you argue, which is, wait a minute, our focus is shifting and what are we forgetting about? But at the end of the day, there's a very critical issue in any democracy, which is that line between parental control and government control. And you can have 10 reasonable people around the table, and they may come at it in 10 reasonable places in terms of where that line is drawn. It is a contentious issue. It always has been from the beginning of the Republic. Somewhere that needs to be decided, and it evolves over time. So where should it be decided? I think it should be decided as close as possible to the community, because that input is really essential to try to find out, where that balance is. And it's the same thing around sort of indoctrination and education. And when you think about the flashpoints of, we're wasting our time on CRT because CRT isn't taught, but there was just as much discussion in boardrooms around issues that really were issues. Acceleration of mathematics, is that a good thing or a bad thing from an equity standpoint? Whether SROs should be in the school, that was something, and still is, that that's debated around school safety. Disciplinary policy, whether it should be restorative justice or whether it should be more suspension based, that's something that's debated. Magnet school admissions, should it be test scores, should it not be? That's being debated. All these things, those are real issues, and they really do impact the students in the school, the faculty in the school, and they need to be adjudicated. So as much as, yes, you'd want to see a clear balance between all these things discussed in a boardroom, there are certain times in American history, and now is one of them, where you see more around these issues. And then I think the final point is the fact that the school boards certainly have their flaws in terms of parents or those interested in student outcomes, having a voice. I think that we have to recognize over the last 30, 40 years, really a lot of power has shifted to the states. And the places where there are mayoral control, which is the interesting question in DC, I just would put your attention on the fact that New York is a mayoral control city. And I think what's fascinating about what just happened is that the idea behind mayoral control is put the power in one person so that they're accountable and then voters will know. That to some extent makes sense. I would argue it's a lot of power to put in the hands of one person rather than 5, 7, or 9, where you at least have a transparent dialogue in public. But let's say you agree with that. Then the question is, well, will voters vote for or against the mayor on education? And in this particularly, contentious mayoral race that we had in New York City, not taking a side on any candidate, the reality is that education really was not a substantive issue. It was about affordability. There may have been more airtime on Middle Eastern politics than there was on education. There was very little. I think Chalkbeat had an article about how there was 164 words on the website in terms of position around education at the beginning, which you're talking about a school district with 900,000 plus kids. So that's not a lot of airtime. So now one person has control of 900,000 kids without really a public discussion about what makes sense and what doesn't. And at least in school board elections, you have that discussion, even if it's narrower than we want, and even if certainly special interests sometimes, pervade. I think the other added point is that I just came from Albany this morning, and I think it reinforces the argument that when you have power in different places, special interests, regardless of whether it's a progressive group, a conservative group, a teachers union, they will find that power. There was just a few days ago, this was a big talk in Albany, a 15,000 person rally in Albany that NICET, which is the teachers union, put together on pension benefits and making pension benefits better for younger teachers. And so that is something that they're voicing as the legislature is now doing the budget. And, as you can imagine, 15,000 people congregating in Albany is that certainly gets attention. That doesn't happen every day. So I think for all those reasons, wherever we are in the political system, you're going to have this issue of, well, maybe sometimes adults may not, vote like we want, but that is really part of democracy. And then the final point is, I think that one question I grapple with the most is, do you move elections to November where they're off cycle? That is, I think, an increasingly popular view. And I understand why, because I do think it would obviously increase turnout. I think the one thing that we need to be cautious about, and maybe there's just more research studies that need to be done to make sure that this is going to be worth the trade-off, is that now you're putting them in the crossfire of the polarization that local districts do somewhat avoid, not totally, because you could turn on YouTube and you can see videos of lots of polarization in boardrooms. But when you look at the data at Carnegie Corporation, just put out recent statistics on national polarization versus local, it is dramatically higher at the national level, like that over 87% of people say it's a problem at the national level, 30% at the local level. There is less polarization because people are in the same room with each other. They see, eye to eye with each other. They engage in civil discourse. They understand that their neighbor may think differently, but it's real rather than on the corners of social media where it could be quite destructive. So I think that that's the one thing that I wish that we can encourage higher turnout in and off cycle. That would be ideal. Whether that's realistic or not, I admit it's a tall order. But those are just some brief thoughts, just to try to give a chance for everybody to ask questions. But
so thank you both. Just one, not a quick question maybe, but one question that hasn't really, on an issue that hasn't totally been raised is, on the one hand, we think democracy is a good thing. On the other hand, it doesn't always produce the right answer or the best outcome for kids in the examples that you cite. So what thoughts do you have, or what's your perspective on the extent to which we ought to, as we're moving towards a more choice-based environment where parents have more options to send their kids to the school that they feel is best for their child, whether it is or it isn't, it's still their choice, whether that's sort of the more, that has more efficacy from a democratic point of view, if you will, than voting. Giving parents the sort of options to choose their school as opposed to the option of which candidate to vote for.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So it's got great comments. It's got kind of previous 3 reforms I advocate for. One's election timing, one is information, and the other is school choice. But I think about it a little bit differently, because I think in reality, even places that have school choice, most students still go to traditional public schools. Even in a place like DC or Detroit, still 50% are public schools. So for me,
except New Orleans.
Yeah, except New Orleans. Yeah, if you get rid of public schools, make it much harder. Yeah. So for me, the reason how I think about school choice is not so much like does it empower parents. I think that's important, and certainly for the culture war issues, these are difficult questions that people can disagree. It's not obvious to me why we should let like a bunch of old people without kids impose their values on the students, which is I think how it works through the democratic process. So for me, that's an area where school choice is obviously a way out, where reasonable people who disagree can choose the value bucket, the value combination they like. But I think school choice is most important through the competitive effects on the public schools for the students who stay in the public schools. And for me, I think that's the main criteria through which we should be thinking about it, given the reality that outside of New Orleans, that's still going to be the bulk. And so far, I think the evidence is pretty encouraging that when there is school choice, that changes the internal governance of public schools because now they are competing to retain students. And, I think the effect sizes are not huge, but it's, but they're positive, they're not negative. We don't see, my read of the evidence is we don't see public schools being hurt by choice. So that's why I think school choice is great because it complements democracy, right? I think it addresses some of the perverse incentives. I think it creates some countervailing incentives to serve students well because now they have exit options. And so that's how I think about that issue. Again, and for that reason, I think thinking about universal versus targeted programs, I think targeted programs, in my opinion, are more desirable because if we want competitive forces, it's not obvious to me that the things you do to compete for advantaged rich kids is the same thing you do to compete for disadvantaged low-income kids. And certainly if we think about who's being served most poorly right now, it's the latter. So I would love to channel that competition to serving those second bucket, not the first bucket.
Just to be explicit on what I think you're arguing that school choice, the competitive pressure can align the incentives because the adult interests that you're arguing predominant in the political process become implicated by performance issues.
Exactly. It mutes. Yeah. So if you're saying, if we have parents that want one thing, we have school employees that want the other, and if we do what school employees want, the parents leave, that might actually cause us not to do what the employees want, right? So it provides a countervailing incentive in cases where the interests of parents and non-parents are conflicted to put a little bit more weight on the interests of parents because you want the dollars, not just their votes. Exactly.
I think that.
Go ahead.
Just the two interesting things about school choice. So first of all, Michael Harney had some research that came out recently that I thought was very interesting and intuitive, which is that board members are actually in lockstep on a lot of different contentious issues with the general public, more or less, but on school choice, not so much. They are definitely anti-school choice as a group. And, I think a lot about this. I mean, I think that there are two things that I think school board members particularly struggle with outside of large urban areas or very large districts. One is the diseconomies of scale when you have a system like in New York where money will come out of the public school budget because you have a bunch of fixed costs. And if you lose students, your fixed cost doesn't necessarily go away. And economically, it's quite difficult to manage in smaller districts. And it's ironic because in many states where districts are smaller, there's a push toward consolidation of school districts, which obviously a lot of people don't want, but there is a push toward that, and also a consolidation of services. So this is going the other way. It's kind of fragmenting the economic base. And then the second, issue that I think is really interesting to think about is that I think competition, as I come from the business world, is very intuitive and it makes organizations better, but you do have to be playing by similar rules. And the problem that we have in many states is that, you have, especially in a state like New York, where there's a tremendous amount of regulation. So you have the public schools playing by the rules of regulation that could be literally thousands of pages, and then charter schools that may have a lot more flexibility. And I got to say, if I'm competing against a charter school as a public school board member, I just want more flexibility, and then I'm happy to compete, but not when my hands are tied.
So if I can pick up on something, Scott, that your remarks made me think of. So Vlad, you're arguing that essentially there's too much democracy in the governance of public education. And so thinking beyond the ideas you mentioned about possible governance reforms, one of the unique aspects of education governance is that it's not unique, it's unusual, is it's a single purpose function, right? That, we have a set of government institutions for public schools, whereas other aspects of municipal governance are sort of part of general governance. And mayoral control is one way of bringing education into the general system of municipal governance. And Scott, I think you were right to say that a lot of the public rhetoric around arguments for mayoral control is that it will increase democracy or increase accountability because you have a visible person who can be held accountable for results. But I think actually the real reason why it makes sense in some settings is that it insulates a little bit, because a mayor like a Bloomberg in New York can do unpopular things on education, but he's reelected for other reasons. And so there's actually some insulation. So anyways, that's a long-winded way of saying, should we revisit the single purpose nature of education governance?
Can I jump in? Yeah, I mean, I think I'm skeptical. Yeah, I'm skeptical because I think my diagnosis of the problems are different than that. And so I think some of the arguments for general purpose governments is kind of along the lines that you lay out. I think some people argue that it will reduce the influence of special interest groups in elections. I don't think we have much empirical evidence for that mechanism. But I think what it gets wrong is I think, first we'll start with kind of the version that you're arguing against, which is it makes it more visible, more accountability. I think the DC example shows that kind of model of the world assumes that voters want good schools and they're going to hold the mayor accountable.
Yeah.
And I think that's just incorrect. So I think often voters, especially when there's trade-offs, will not do that. And so I think that historical account of why mayoral control is better, I think is just empirically wrong because it assumes that voters care a lot more about academic outcomes than they do. So then to the other example, so you're right. It will maybe blunt some of these perverse incentives. I don't think it will necessarily bring in better countervailing incentives. So it will certainly have, there'll be less accountability for good things and bad things. And I think the Bloomberg example is interesting because, Bloomberg is celebrated for many things that he did in New York. He's also the person that brought whole language and Lucy Calkins into New York schools. So again, and it's not obvious to me that we would expect on average mayors who are get this alternative account where they're just insulated and voters won't hold them accountable because they're care more about crime. It's not obvious that in the absence of better countervailing incentives, they'll make good decisions. I think they'll just make different decisions. But I think the key challenge is there's just not incentive alignment to serve kids well. And I don't think reducing some of the accountability pressures via mayoral control fixes that problem. I think we need to bring in some countervailing incentives to really move in the right direction.
Part of how I think about it is, do I trust the broader population, which includes parents and others, or do I trust one person that's basically going to be in the role that may be insulated because when an individual goes to vote, they may be prioritizing education third on the list. Even if they hate that person's education policy, they're going to vote for them anyway because of crime or taxes or whatever else. And I always would err on the side of people rather than the one person. And one thing that I think we need to start thinking about when we look at the push toward legislating more education, which is happening in red and blue states, that's the one thing that states agree on, is let's start legislating, DEI or legislating curriculum, is that we have a gerrymandered system when it comes to the state legislature in many places. And many places now, including New York, but we're just one of many places, have more important primaries than general elections. So what does that mean? It means that voter turnout that's really going to decide who that human being is going to be in the legislature is even lower than we think, because you need to look at the primary voter turnout, not the general election. And with the gerrymandering, you tend to get more extreme candidates. And even when you think about mayors or governors, you don't have the gerrymandering, but you have primaries. And again, you have one party determining who that candidate's going to be. And in many cities, both red and blue, it's almost preordained that if it's the Republican or Democrat, depending on whether it's red or blue, they're going to be the ones to prevail. So you have a narrow set of people, just like you do in school board elections, deciding who these general purpose candidates are going to be for general purpose government. And I think that, you really get then special interests and narrowness the same way that you might in a school board election where only 10% of people come out.
Hey, Michael, are there any questions in the chat?
What would be Professor Kogan's governance solution? Any examples in the United States?
So New Orleans, I think, is a great case study. I think it's probably too radical to scale, but I think it shows what's possible.
Because Indianapolis just tried to do something very similar.
Yeah, well, I think it's another city to watch to see what happens. Again, I guess I'm of two minds. One is maybe democracy is the worst system except for all the rest, and we just have to accept the limitations, right, and be just more realistic in how we think about what democracy does, and maybe this is the best we can do. Or again, the other, and this goes back to Scott's earlier comments, is are there things we can do on the margin that's not as radical as Indianapolis or New Orleans that I think would help align incentives? I think there's a couple of things that Scott mentioned. One is information, right? Again, and we can definitely have a conversation about performance measurement and what performance measures are the best. I totally am sensitive to those concerns, but putting academic growth data on the ballot seems to me a great way to remind voters of performance. And again, the minority versus majority coalitions is a great point as well. But especially if the alternative is also Indiana, which is introducing party labels for school board elections. I think that's a terrible idea because we know from other elections that when you put party labels on the ballot, that crowds out performance considerations. And we see that in judicial elections. So if you agree with me that the problem is that voters don't care enough about performance, the last thing you want to do is put party labels on the ballots to make performance even less salient. So I think to me, if the choice is between party labels and academic labels, I want the academic labels. I think election timing is one possibility, and Scott is totally right. I mean, we have some evidence suggesting that on-cycle elections improve accountability pressures, not just because overall turnout is higher, but because a larger share of voters are parents. And we have 2 papers from California showing that there is more accountability for incumbents for academic outcomes when elections are held in November of presidential years, maybe because parents are a larger voting bloc. That's one state, so I'm definitely open to the possibility it totally backfires. And so I think we should let the evidence speak and at least try it and see whether it has the positive effects. I hope it has, and if not, we should totally give up on election timing. And then the last is school choice, and I think again, school choice, particularly targeted choice, is a great way to complement democracy. It's a great way to help align some of the incentives without getting rid of democracy, but really getting more political power to people that have the most skin in the game, which is parents, and especially on issues where the interests of parents and other voters conflict. Why wouldn't we just let parents make those choices, or at least create pressure for school districts to be responsive to parents? So those are the 3 things that I would advocate. That's not about getting rid of democracy. It's not about mayoral control. It's not about empowering states. It's keeping things as they are, but making a few things change on the margin that, again, if I'm right, it'll make things a little bit better.
Another place where we agree on is the party labels, because I think that the argument for the party labels as well, you're giving more transparency to voters, but I think it's incredibly deceiving when it comes to decisions that boards have to make. It's a governance body, and at the end of the day, there are so many decisions that I don't think fall clearly between Republican and Democrat, and you can have 2 board members with 2 very different political views making similar decisions on lots of different things. Sure, there are flashpoint issues, and there are many of them that you would align people by party and generally maybe be directionally correct, but I don't think you're doing anybody a service by inserting more partisanship into a process that is at least attempting to be nonpartisan, and I think oftentimes is nonpartisan.
So one quick idea that I know has been suggested by at least one member around this table is having students participate in boards as part of the governance system. What do you think about that?
So in New York, actually, there's a law that was passed where now you have to have an ex officio student on every board. The way where I come out on this is that I first of all, I don't really think that a state law is the right way to go, but I'm generally not. I'm very sensitive to state. I believe in state accountability. There are some state laws that I'm comfortable with, but I think that student input is incredibly important. I just think that there are a lot of ways that you can achieve it. You can achieve it with an ex officio school board member. In Maryland, they have at least one district, if not more, that have a voting member that's a student. You could also have committee structures where you have students on those committees advising the board and feeding into the board. You can do student survey work, and you can really get a sense of what your student body is thinking, because if you have one person sitting on the board, you don't know if they're going to represent student interests. And I also think it's important to note, student interest is not monolithic. If you get 10 students in the room, they're going to have 10 very different ideas of what should be emphasized at the school, whether there should be standardized testing or not, whether art and music is more or less important than English. So there's going to be all kinds of views. So I think that it's important to try to gather those views before you're making any decisions, because this is the population that you're serving. But at the same time, I'm not sure it's as simple as saying, oh, one person should be on the board, although I don't have any opposition to that if that's what a community decides to do.
Similar question. One of the challenges on local school boards is often sort of the lack of relevant expertise, right? So people get on boards because they're particularly passionate about a particular issue, and they may not have familiarity with other aspects of a district's operation. So one way to avoid that could be to sort of blend appointed board members and elected board members, such that, you have to think about who's doing the appointing, but the city council or the mayor could say things like, well, it would be really helpful to have an attorney and a finance or someone with budget expertise, and sort of, round out the results of democracy in a way that might enhance overall performance. Is that worth thinking about?
Yeah, I guess, I haven't thought much about it, but to me, I think the cautionary tale is like the science of reading versus whole language, where I think in that case, expertise would not necessarily have pointed you in the direction that the consensus now seems to be the right direction. So I don't I think lack of expertise is certainly an issue. I don't necessarily think that's the main barrier. I think it's the lack of right incentives. So I'd rather get the incentives
Become
right.
expert in the right thing.
Yeah, I'd rather get the incentives right. Let's reward schools for teaching kids how to read, and then let them respond to those incentives, and hopefully that will cause them to converge. Or maybe there's different ways to get there, and there's different communities. So I'd rather focus on the incentives and getting it right, rather than trying to get expertise in the front end, assuming that experts are going to have right decisions. Because I think sometimes they will, and sometimes maybe they won't. But if we don't have the right incentives, I don't think expertise will be a solution by itself.
I think when it comes to single issue candidates, one of the things that we do in our region, and I think this is a very good thing to do, is governance training. So when a candidate wins, they first come in, just really introduce them to the broad responsibilities of being in a governance seat. That you may have an issue that you're very passionate about, but there are a host of issues that you're responsible for. The place where I see potentially the biggest issue with expertise is on the finance side. If you have a board that just by luck of the draw, because the citizens are deciding, doesn't have anyone, not one person that has any grounding in finance. If you're in a state where you have jurisdiction over your budget and tax levy increase, that is a big responsibility, and you're doing it without full knowledge of even what you're supposed to be overseeing. So I think you need, mechanisms for intensive training. That's probably the number one thing I would say, just to make sure that you know the right questions to ask. You don't have to be the expert, but you need to know the questions. Otherwise, it's a very difficult task. That's the place where, if you think about a university board or a corporate board or a nonprofit board, to your point, you're picking expertise to some extent. Oh, I don't have anybody that knows anything about technology, and I need that in my organization. I'm going to draw a board member in with that expertise. And obviously here you can't do that unless you went to a different system. So I would say training, super important.
All right, that's going to have to be the last word. We're done. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you for all your questions. Thank you.